It's a cold, wet, and gray morning in the hills of Saxony, now Germany, sometime in the late 1400s. Men are digging with crude, medieval pickaxes deep into the earth, looking for a precious metal only recently reintroduced to European life. Copper, once a well-supplied material in a now long-forgotten Roman Empire, has finally begun to regain its significance. And while the ore these men dig for may appear to the eye like copper, in German, Kupfer, they soon realize that what they've been digging is not copper at all. It's far less malleable and can't easily be hammered into valuable cookware or jewelry. Frustrated, they curse Old Nick, a Saxon term for the devil, and give this new and difficult metal its first ever name, a name that would only grow more fitting with time. They called it Kupfernickel, or as we might say in English, the devil's copper. Centuries later, in 1751, Swedish chemist Baron Axel Cronstedt isolated the new metal and gave it the proper name we all know today, nickel. Nickel's electrochemical properties, high melting point, alloy-friendly nature, as well as a few other interesting qualities, make it quite useful for a few distinct yet critical applications. Today, nickel is used in the production of, among other things, stainless steel, jet engine turbines, and EV batteries. Global nickel reserves are highly concentrated in a few distinct areas, and its demand has risen along with a global shift towards electric vehicles. Moreover, the process for refining nickel has rapidly advanced, unlocking low-grade reserves for high-end uses. As the geopolitical landscape shifts, battery demand grows, and refining technology improves, the story of nickel continues to earn the metal its old Saxon moniker, the devil's copper. Welcome to the Margin of Sanity podcast. Today is all about nickel. We're going to dive deep into the history of nickel, what makes it special, what it's used for, how it's obtained, who has it, who needs it, the crazy world of nickel and EV batteries, nickel recycling, geopolitics. We're going to hit it all. Get ready to be an expert on all things nickel. Just a quick reminder, if you like the show and you want to show a little love with a like, a comment, or a 5-star review, that engagement really helps me out and it helps other people find the show. And if you're listening on Spotify, YouTube, or Apple Podcasts, and you want to read this write-up and look at all the awesome interactive maps I've cooked up, all of that and so much more is available on the Margin of Sanity Substack. All right, nickel, the devil's copper, baby. Let's get into it. Part 1. History. Unlike steel or copper, nickel's history can be adequately summarized with some overdue brevity on my part. In its early days, during the 19th century, nickel was exclusively useful as a steel alloy in the early production of stainless steel. For any who don't know, an alloy is simply the combination of two or more metals. For example, brass is an alloy of copper and zinc. Stainless steel, however, is comprised of steel, chromium, and, usually, nickel. While nickel may not make up the majority of this alloy by weight, stainless steel production continues to drive the vast majority of nickel demand on Earth. But back to history. Around 1820, the great Michael Faraday was one of the first to intentionally add nickel to steel, and by the mid-19th century, nickel plating had been invented, using electric currents to coat other metals with nickel for corrosion resistance. Still, these were early days. When World War I broke out, demand for strong stainless steel for guns and machinery caused nickel's value to skyrocket. A couple decades later, during World War II, demand for nickel was so great that the US began minting its 5-cent coins, nickels, with silver and copper to preserve the national supply of the now critical nickel. A newfound need for strong tank armor was the primary culprit, and even today our 5-cent coins are still mostly, 75%, copper. Throughout the 20th century, stainless steel found its way into the world's sinks, cookware, appliances, industrial machinery, and a bunch of other end uses which are too numerous to name in full. The advent of commercial flight provided yet another use for nickel-based superalloys, primarily due to its strength, durability, and resistance to high temperatures and corrosion, making it ideal for jet engine components and other vital parts. And then came the 2000s, the inconvenient truth, and Man-Bear Pig. As society has made a shift towards electric vehicles, nickel's role in the green economy has become as critical as it is controversial. But let's back up. Part 2. What makes nickel special? Nickel's primary role as an alloy with steel and chromium, aka stainless steel, has to do with its hard yet ductile nature, as well as its corrosion-resistant properties. In other words, nickel is strong without being brittle, and naturally resists decay from chemicals or simple exposure to the elements. Chromium is what makes stainless steel, well, stainless, but nickel is what makes it both highly workable and reliably corrosion-resistant in real-world use. It stays tough at low temperatures and improves the steel's resistance in many acidic environments. Moreover, adding nickel to stainless steel keeps the material from turning hard and brittle when you bend, stamp, or weld it, enabling manufacturers to make deep sinks, thin cookware, tanks, and complex piping without any cracking. Nickel's temperature-resistant properties, more on this in a second, also help stainless steel keep its toughness and shape at high temperatures. That's why nickel-bearing stainless works well for hot piping, heat exchangers, and ovens. Basically, nickel is the secret sauce for stainless steel alloys. I've mentioned nickel superalloys comprising many jet engine parts and turbines. Nickel's extremely high melting point, about 1455 degrees Celsius, makes it an excellent metal to use for anything that gets super hot, like a jet engine, for example. Add the corrosion resistance, strength, and malleability I mentioned earlier, and you can imagine why it's a key metal for the industrial sector. Moreover, nickel is ferromagnetic, which really just means it's naturally very magnetic, so long as it hasn't been heated above a certain temperature. When you mix nickel with other metals, it makes special magnetic materials that solve real-world problems. Nickel-iron alloys, for example, are used to make magnetic shields that block hum around super-sensitive gear. Think lab instruments, studio microphones, and some medical devices. And tiny transformers that pass delicate signals cleanly in both audio and measurement equipment. Nickel also teams up with aluminum and cobalt to form alnico magnets, which stay stable when hot and give a smooth, predictable response. Perfect for guitar pickups and some speakers. You could use other materials, but nickel-based magnets are quieter, more precise, and more heat-tolerant, which is why they're the go-to for these jobs. Finally, let's talk about the elephant in the room, EV batteries. It's somewhat fortuitous that Michael Faraday, a godfather of electrochemistry and electromagnetism, also happened to take an interest in nickel. While Faraday famously developed a practical framework for the use of nickel in the production of stainless steel, nickel's electrochemical properties would give the metal an entirely new use case for humanity almost 200 years later. Faraday's Laws of Electrolysis were published in 1833, 50 years before the first electric light bulb would shine in New York City. To me, this is a wonderful detail. But what does it have to do with EV batteries? We will cover the EV battery situation in much more detail later on, but in short, nickel, together with manganese and cobalt, serves as an ideal material for the cathode in an EV battery. It's the specific electrochemical properties of nickel, which enable this battery type to hold more charge relative to its size and weight. Considering that EV range is a major source of competition among automakers, nickel has suddenly found itself the prettiest girl at the party in the world of electric vehicle manufacturing. Part 3. Nickel usage. Now that you possess a general understanding of what makes nickel so useful, let's take a look at its actual usage over time by sector. Below is a chart depicting the percentage of nickel supply going towards various applications, from stainless steel to nickel-based superalloys to EV batteries. I've included a projection for the year 2030. As you can see in the chart, most nickel goes towards the production of stainless steel. In 2020, 70% of all nickel went into stainless steel, with only 8% flowing towards battery production. 2 decades earlier, battery production wasn't a major demand source for nickel at all. It's what happened after 2020 that catches the eye. The percentage of total nickel supply flowing into the battery segment doubled from 2020 to 2024. This new source of demand for the devil's copper has become the story of nickel in the 21st century. I'm going to mostly focus on stainless steel and batteries in this write-up, but here's a brief explanation of each component in the above chart for reference. As just mentioned, stainless steel was and still is the most prevalent source of demand for nickel. Most nickel goes here. Stainless steel, which is comprised of 8 to 10% nickel, benefits from nickel's strength, malleability, and corrosion resistance. Think sinks, cookware, tanks, pipes, hospital gear, food plants, and building facades. Alloy steels, which are not quite stainless steels, make up a much smaller percentage of nickel demand. These alloy steels use less nickel than stainless steel, often 1 to 4%. In this case, the nickel serves to toughen ordinary steels, especially in the cold. Uses include gears, shafts, tools, pipelines, armor plate, and heavy industrial parts. Cast versions show up in various valves, pumps, and housings. Plating refers to electroplating and consistently accounts for about 7% of nickel demand. In this case, a thin nickel coat is applied to cheaper materials in order to protect them from rust and give a clean, silvery finish. It's also often partnered together with chrome. Perhaps you've heard of nickel chrome plating before. You'll see some form of nickel plating on appliance parts, bathroom fixtures, tools, coins, connectors, and countless small components. Ever wonder why jet engines don't melt? Well, nickel-based alloys are the high-performance superalloys. Inconel, Hastelloy, Monel are all types of these superalloys that keep your airplane engines from turning to liquid mid-flight. These superalloys keep their strength when red hot and shrug off harsh chemicals, so they go into jet engines, turbines, chemical plants, offshore gear, and marine hardware. Batteries, especially EV batteries, have become a very relevant source of nickel demand in recent years. In nickel-based EV cathodes, nickel boosts energy per kilogram, which means longer range, lighter weight, and smaller batteries. We are going to go super deep on batteries, so don't worry about that. Oh right, and other refers to a random assortment of other uses. Think nickel catalysts for making foods and chemicals, coins, welding, consumables, magnetic alloys, and little things like nickel foils and plating in electronics. Any guitar players out there are probably familiar with nickel-wound strings. After all, nickel is magnetic, and your guitar pickup is basically just a little electromagnet. But I digress. As I've said, the real demand driver behind nickel comes from stainless steel and, as of recently, batteries. But before we go too deep on steel and batteries, we have a few other topics to get to. Part 4. Nickel mining and production. Okay, before we get into maps, let's try and understand a few details about how nickel is actually mined and processed. There are essentially two types of nickel ore deposits: sulfide and laterite. Sulfide ore. Just like we saw with copper, sulfide deposits are usually, but not always, deeper in the earth, and the ore is extracted via underground mines. Canada, Russia, and Australia all have a large percentage of sulfide ore deposits. Sulfide nickel ore is often found alongside copper, platinum, and cobalt, which conveniently helps out with the otherwise less than ideal economics of underground mining. The process of extracting sulfide nickel ore isn't all too different from that of sulfide copper ore. The nickel-bearing rocks are ground up and pumped full of chemically treated water. The water is then pumped full of air to create bubbles, called flotation. And the majority of that nickel-rich ore gets stuck to the bubbles on top. That floating, nickel-dense mixture is scooped off the top and becomes concentrate. That concentrate then gets smelted into matte before it is refined even further using processes like the Sherrod-Gordon process or the Mond process, and ultimately becomes pure, greater than 99.8% Ni nickel. Importantly, this is called Class 1 nickel, and it can be used for anything you need nickel for: steel, batteries, jet engine alloys, etc. Laterite ore. Now, laterite ore deposits, sometimes called oxide ore, usually, if not always, occur near the surface. Usually in tropical regions, think Indonesia, the Philippines, New Caledonia, Cuba, and Madagascar. These laterite ores are mined using open pit methods and produce a lot of nickel. But there's a catch. The nickel found in laterite deposits is almost always chemically bound with iron and some other elements. This makes the refining of laterite nickel very energy intensive. Now, traditionally, laterite nickel was perfectly fine for nickel's primary end use, stainless steel. Why? Well, it's actually quite simple. Steel is just iron plus coke, met coal. Stainless steel is iron plus nickel plus chromium plus coke, met coal. So if you want to make stainless steel, you can sort of just use this laterite ore like a store-bought margarita mix. Just add tequila, met coal, and a lime wedge, chromium, and boom, stainless steel. There are two types of laterite ore: ferronickel, Feni, and nickel pig iron, NPI. I'm likely going to use them somewhat interchangeably, since they both face similar restrictions. But the main difference between the two is nickel content. Feni has more nickel content than NPI, but neither is well suited for much else besides stainless steel production. Essentially, the presence of iron in both Feni and NPI doesn't really impede the stainless steel making process at all. It does, however, seriously limit the ability to actually refine that NPI Feni into pure nickel. It's tough to get the lime juice out of the margarita mix, earning this type of nickel the categorization of Class 2 nickel. Or at least that was the case, but I'm getting ahead of myself. I will get to some serious changes in the nickel refining process and the implications on that class system later, but for now I thought it was important to just start with a basic understanding of those two types of deposits: laterite and sulfide. Sulfide is Class 1 and can be easily refined into pure nickel, while laterite, Class 2, is usually bound with iron and was, until recently anyway, really only suited for stainless steel production. Part 5. Where does it come from? Where does it go? As has become the custom in my resource-related write-ups, I've created some interactive maps for you all to make this part of the process a bit more intuitive. If you're just listening, I'll do my best to describe key observations for each map. But first, let's contextualize some stuff. Relative to copper, bauxite, which is aluminum ore, and especially something like iron, not that much nickel gets produced each year, weight-wise anyway. I have a graph here of 2023 world mine production by metal content in metric tons. Iron was 1.5 billion metric tons, while nickel was 3.6 million. Copper, notably higher than nickel, was 22 million. Bauxite, aluminum ore, was 400 million metric tons. Cobalt, 230,000 metric tons. And gold, 3,000 metric tons. Now, that 3.6 million metric tons of nickel is worth about $54 billion, assuming current nickel price on the London Metal Exchange of $15,000 per ton. Copper's 22 million tons are currently worth $211 billion, and iron's 1.5 billion tons at $100 a ton are worth $1.5 trillion. Gold, with only 3,000 tons produced in 2023, was worth about $328 billion. I love little comparisons like this because I think it helps us put some stuff into context. The nickel market, all things considered, is big, but not that big. Not as big as copper, anyway. So next, maybe we should look at nickel production over time. If you could see the graph, you would see that global production of nickel has increased over time, but more dramatically in recent years, likely due to the rise of China and the advent of electric vehicles. I'll also mention that estimates show global nickel reserves contain about 70% laterite deposits. So, now that we have some context overall, let's look at some maps. First off, I think we should just take a look at nickel mine production by country. Indonesia is by far the top producer, cranking out more nickel than the next several countries combined. The Philippines, Russia, and New Caledonia, owned by France, follow. with Canada and Australia also in the top tier. What's interesting is the split between laterite and sulfide deposits. Tropical countries like Indonesia and the Philippines are mostly laterite, with Canada and Russia being mostly sulfide. Now, mine production is one thing, but let's also take a look at reserves. For this map, I've included both proven and inferred nickel reserves. Now, this map surprised me. Australia, while only producing a small share of the world's nickel each year, also possesses a big chunk of global reserves, albeit still only half that of Indonesia. Russia, despite producing a lot of nickel every year, doesn't actually rank near the top for nickel reserves. If you could look at the map, you would see that France actually produces a lot of nickel and has a lot of nickel reserves, but it's not actually the nation of France geographically. France actually controls a small island called New Caledonia off the coast of Australia. And that is where France's nickel reserves are. No surprise, since New Caledonia has a tropical climate, all of those reserves for France are laterite. Australia's reserves, on the other hand, are 50-50 laterite and sulfide. The US does have 2.8 million metric tons of nickel reserves, and all of those are sulfide. Much like Australia, Brazil actually possesses a lot of nickel reserves relative to the amount of nickel it produces each year, making both Australia and Brazil sort of dark horses for future nickel supply. The next map shows the top 25 nickel mines by production volume, and no surprise, a lot of those are in Indonesia, with only one in Brazil, a couple in Russia, one in China, 3 in Australia, and 2 in Canada. You'll also see a mine in the US, located somewhere in the northern part of Michigan. This mine was set to close in 2025, but it seems like it's extending operations over the next couple of years. If you want to take a look at all these charts yourself and interact with them and see all the data I've included in the tooltips for the map, just go on the Margin of Sanity Substack. This post is entirely free, for now anyway, and you might find it really interesting. So, I think we've established the dramatic concentration of nickel in Southeast Asia, but now let's take a look at how this nickel is being consumed. I've chosen to approach this by first showing you a map of nickel imports by nation, and then we can take a look at stainless steel and battery production by country. All of this together should give us a thorough picture of what's happening in the global nickel market. So first up, imports. China towers over everyone in nickel imports, and most of what they bring in is in the form of ferronickel and nickel pig iron, not refined metal. India is a big importer too, but for stainless steel scrap rather than pure nickel. The US, Japan, and South Korea focus more on refined nickel imports, while European countries like Belgium and Italy import a ton of scrap for remelting. As always, China is dominating when it comes to imports here. By now, Margin of Sanity readers probably already understand where a lot of that nickel is going. Steel. China also imports only 6% refined nickel and 8% matte. But wait, isn't China an EV powerhouse? Don't you need Class 1 nickel for EV batteries, not to mention superalloys? It's not like China doesn't make airplanes, right? Rather than trying to deconstruct all of this, let's just take a look at which countries are producing the world's stainless steel and EV batteries. No surprise, it's China. EV battery production by country shows China absolutely dominating, with 10 million battery packs produced in 2023. The United States is in second place with 1.4 million battery packs produced in 2023, with Poland, Hungary, South Korea, Japan, and Sweden following. When it comes to stainless steel production, we do see some similar characters. In 2023, it was China, of course, that produced the most stainless steel, with 33.8 million metric tons of stainless steel produced. Indonesia, interestingly, followed in second place with 5 million metric tons produced. And then India with 4 million metric tons, Japan with 2.9 million, the US with 2.4, South Korea 2.4, and Taiwan with 1.4 million metric tons produced in 2023. So China is definitely producing a ton of EV batteries, but where the hell are they getting the nickel from? Indonesia and the Philippines only really produce Class 2 nickel, And you need class 1 for refined nickel in battery production. So, what's going on? Okay, I think we've covered enough to finally talk about EV batteries. Maybe a few of you are losing your mind because you already know about LFPs and the leaching process for NPI and FENI. But suffice it to say, things have been evolving a lot when it comes to nickel's role in battery production. First, let's just quickly review, because we're getting into a complicated and rapidly evolving territory. Nickel is mostly used in stainless steel production. That nickel usually comes in the form of nickel pig iron, or ferronickel. That NPI and FENI nickel has been imported into China, as China has become the dominant producer of stainless steel. Over the past decade or so, another major demand source for nickel has arisen in the form of EV batteries. For many years, the nickel in those batteries had to be sourced from a different type of nickel deposit, sulfide, because that class 1 nickel could be refined economically into pure nickel. Outside of stainless steel, the majority of nickel's other end uses also require this refined class 1 nickel. And that class 1 nickel was mostly being recovered from mines in Canada, Russia, Australia, and the US. Now that you know all of that, allow me to render much of it somewhat useless. In China, during 2023, almost none of the EV batteries produced were made from traditionally refined class 1 nickel. So what happened? Part 6. The Pig. EV batteries. The summer after my freshman year of college, I worked construction for my buddy's dad, great guy. He had this thing he'd say when we were looking at a job site. He'd point to the hardest, most pain-in-the-ass part of the work, say a load-bearing concrete wall that had to come down, and he'd go, "Yep, that's the pig." So, welcome to the world of EV batteries, or as I've been thinking of it, the pig. How do batteries work anyway? I'm not going to assume you have an electrical engineering background, and fortunately for you, I don't either. So let's just briefly establish a basic understanding of batteries first, so we don't get buried in jargon. Batteries convert chemical energy into electrical energy. Every battery contains 3 basic elements: an anode, a cathode, and an electrolyte. There's also something called a separator, but I think it's safe to leave it out for our purposes. You know when you go to replace batteries in the remote, and one side has a plus and the other has a minus? Those 2 sides are the anode, minus, and the cathode, plus. If you ever saw some nasty stuff leaking out of your battery, well, that right there is the electrolyte. Anodes are made of material that have too many electrons, and, if allowed, would happily give them up to the cathode, which consists of material which seeks to gain electrons. The electrolyte is a sort of liquid which contains ions, charged atoms, which create a sort of electrical pressure inside the battery, since the electrolyte also does not allow electrons to pass through it. When the anode and cathode get connected to one another through a circuit, say a light bulb, that pressure is released. We can now harness those electrons that are allowed to flow between cathode and anode as electricity. A simple way to understand a battery is to think in terms of 2 lakes of water. One lake is on the top of a hill, and the other one is at the bottom. Lake 1 is the anode, since it has an excess of potential energy. Bells should be ringing from high school physics here. Lake 2 is the cathode, at the bottom of the hill, with less pressure than Lake 1. The difference in pressure between the 2 lakes is voltage. The electrolyte is the hill, not the water. When we connect 2 sides of a battery, it's like we've connected a hose from Lake 1 to Lake 2. The water functions like the electrons and moves from Lake 1 to Lake 2. This is a release of energy. In our lake metaphor, the energy conversion is potential energy into kinetic energy, and in a battery, it is chemical energy into electrical energy. When we want to recharge the battery, we simply pump the water from Lake 2 back into Lake 1. EV battery types. Okay, back to EV batteries. Virtually all EV batteries are lithium-ion batteries. Lithium-ion is a reference to the type of ions, Li+, within the electrolyte solution. See, unlike the lake analogy, in a battery, it's only the electrons that are moving through the hose. The lithium atom, in a sense, moves from anode to cathode, lake 1 to lake 2, via the hill itself. But the electron for each of those atoms is moving through the circuit, via the external hose you connected. There are other types of batteries, rarely used for EVs, such as sodium-ion batteries. In that case, it's the sodium atoms that flow from anode to cathode as their electrons move through our external hose, thereby creating a current which we can use to power whatever we choose. For EVs, it's all about the lithium-ion battery. But it's not just the lithium ions within the electrolyte that matter. It's also the chemistry of the anode and cathode material. Moreover, it's the way all three of these elements interact with one another, which equal a powerful, long-lasting, charge-holding, cost-effective, and space-efficient EV battery. So, going back to the lake metaphor for a minute, imagine if you could take Lake 2, the lower lake, and sort of deepen it. You would have a bigger pressure difference between the two lakes, voltage, and you'd also be able to store more water in the lower lake. Well, with lithium-ion batteries, the way to do that is by using a nickel-based cathode. Nickel cathodes. Okay, so for reasons I won't get into because they require a chemistry and physics degree, nickel is a key ingredient to making an awesome cathode for lithium-ion battery chemistry. Vehicles with NMC, nickel, manganese, cobalt, or NCA, nickel, cobalt, aluminum, can drive further on one charge than other battery types. I've never shopped for an EV myself, but if I did, I'm sure range would be one hell of an important factor. Yes, cobalt is also important, but it's really the nickel doing the heavy lifting, chemistry-wise. For an NMC battery, the cathode makeup is 8 parts nickel, 1 part manganese, and 1 part cobalt. In fact, 2 common NMC batteries, NMC 811 and NMC 622, differ primarily because of the difference in the amount of nickel content. Congruent with what the numbers imply, NMC 811 has more nickel than NMC 622. I won't bother to distinguish between NMC and NCA since both involve nickel, but we've arrived at exactly the reason nickel is important in electric vehicles. A typical nickel cathode lithium-ion EV battery contains about 25 kilograms of nickel, which costs roughly $625, depending on nickel prices, which can vary wildly. Nickel is often cited as one of the most significant raw material costs in high-nickel EV batteries. It can account for a substantial portion of the cathode's material cost, and the cathode itself is the most expensive part of the battery cell. All in all, nickel often makes up about 20% of the total raw material cost of producing an EV battery. Just like the engine is the main focal point of a traditional auto, with EVs, it's all about that battery. In 2024, Tesla alone produced over 100 million EV battery cells, not packs, with nickel-based cathodes in-house. Each battery cell, called the 4680, contains about 0.12 kilograms of nickel. At $20,000 per ton for the nickel, we're looking at $20 per kilogram and $2.40 per battery cell. So, we have at least 100 million cells per year at about $2.40 in nickel per cell. That's $240 million per year in nickel, and about 7% of Tesla's total free cash flow for 2024. Now, this isn't really a write-up on EVs, but to understand why Elon has begged folks to go out and mine nickel, take a look at how volatile this metal has been historically. I realize you can't look, but just for reference, in 2006, nickel sold for about $14,000 per ton, and only a few years later, in 2007, it sold for $51,000 per metric ton. That is an extreme example, but even back in 2020 and 2021, nickel sold at some points for $13,000 per ton and at other points for $30,000 per ton. Today, nickel sells for $15,000 per ton. Since nickel contributes so much to the raw material costs of an EV battery, if you're making EVs, you want cheap nickel. Or an alternative to nickel altogether. LFPs, the other kind of cathode. LFP cathodes consist of a lithium and iron phosphate. To use the lake analogy, the chemistry of LFP batteries results in a shallower second lake and an overall gentler slope between both lakes. Now, LFPs have become quite common due to their lower cost, longer life, as well as some other safety advantages. The downside for LFPs is a shorter range and less functionality at lower temperatures. Globally, the current split between LFPs and nickel-based cathodes is basically 50-50. But LFPs are growing fast, mostly due to widespread adoption in China. LFP batteries are dominant in the Chinese market, accounting for a significant majority of domestic EV battery demand in 2024. This is due to the strong presence of major LFP producers like CATL and BYD, and a market that prioritizes cost and safety for a large volume of city-focused EVs. In North America and Europe, high nickel chemistries such as NMC and NCA were still more prevalent in 2024. Car makers here have traditionally focused on offering longer-range EVs to address range anxiety, which favors the high energy density of nickel-based batteries. However, the adoption of LFP batteries is growing in these markets, especially for base models and cheaper EVs. All in all, nickel-based cathodes are basically the superior chemistry, only they're also more expensive. Which brings me back to nickel itself. Finally. Part 7. Nickel is no longer classy. Remember earlier when I made you learn all about this whole class system for nickel? Class 1 can be refined into pure nickel, and Class 2 is only for stainless steel. Remember? Well, what if I told you that is no longer true? Back in 2021, nickel refiners in China developed and tested a new way to refine Class 2 nickel into battery-grade refined nickel. At that time, supply for refined nickel was short, likely due to Russian supply being cut off after the invasion of Ukraine. And this new class conversion became a necessity for the booming global EV market. By 2022, Chinese producers like Tsingshan began rolling out NPI to matte conversion nickel on a wide scale, thereby filling the hole made by Russian supply coming offline. Now, this new method isn't super cost-effective, nor is it very environmentally friendly. In fact, nickel produced with NPI to matte conversion is up to 3 times as carbon-intensive as the traditional method. Not a great look when you're trying to go green. In the West, we don't really need to engage in this sort of nickel refining simply due to the lack of nearby laterite nickel deposits. Still, it's a seriously important development in the world of nickel overall. When prices get high enough, it starts making sense to engage in this process, effectively adding a sort of cap to nickel prices when refined nickel demand spikes. In theory, anyway. Moreover, it makes Indonesian reserves just that bit more valuable. Part 8. Geopolitics of nickel. As you may have already noticed, we have a concentration problem. In 2023, Indonesia made up more than half of global supply of nickel. This gives them a ton of leverage and also can result in price swings anytime we get even a hint of price hikes or export restrictions. Officials in Jakarta have even flirted with the idea of forming an OPEC-style nickel alliance with Russia and Australia, although this is not a likely outcome, in my view. Russia also complicates things. Norn nickel is still a major source of high-purity Class 1 nickel. It hasn't been directly sanctioned by the US or EU, but some European buyers have stepped back for reputational reasons. Meanwhile, more Russian metal has been finding a home in China, another sign of supply chains splitting at the edges, even if global trade is still very interconnected. The export ban. Back in 2020, Indonesia implemented a full ban on nickel ore exports, something they had been toying with for a decade. They did this in order to force downstreaming and ultimately capture a bigger share of the value chain. In essence, this move meant that foreign firms, mostly Chinese, would have to either buy nickel products, mate or even stainless steel itself, or they'd have to come in and build the refineries themselves. China doesn't ever seem to balk at the idea of intertwining itself with the economies of neighboring nations, and so, immediately following the ban, a flood of capital and equipment started pouring into Indonesia. Chinese firms set up their own refineries and mills on Indonesian soil, and then started buying their own mate and stainless steel. The ban also sparked a lot of domestic nickel refining and steelmaking in Indonesia. If you recall, Indonesia now holds the number 2 spot in global stainless steel production. Since nickel superalloys are still used in the manufacturing of a lot of military equipment, armor, this consolidation of Beijing's power around the world's largest nickel producer by far poses some national security risks to the US and its allies. As a result, we've seen a push from both the Biden and Trump administration to shore up the nickel supply chain, either through friendshoring or even subsidies for domestic nickel production. Domestic nickel politics, beyond batteries. We've talked a lot about batteries here, but nickel actually plays a role in some other parts of the green economy as well. In wind turbines, nickel-based alloys are utilized in demanding components such as blades and gearboxes due to their high strength, exceptional corrosion resistance, and ability to maintain structural integrity under high temperatures. Moreover, nickel plays a crucial yet often overlooked role in the production of green hydrogen. While other technologies use expensive materials like platinum and iridium, more cost-effective and common methods for producing hydrogen rely heavily on nickel. This is because nickel is a key component in the anode, cathode, and flow field of electrolyzer cells, often in the form of pure nickel or nickel-based alloys. Nickel's relatively low cost and resistance to corrosive chemicals make it an essential material for these technologies. Beyond just electric vehicles, nickel's use in hydrogen production and sustainable fuels like biodiesel and sustainable aviation fuel is making it an increasingly important and diverse commodity, helping to decarbonize sectors that are difficult to electrify directly. Nickel also contributes to carbon capture technologies, which are increasingly crucial for reducing greenhouse gas emissions. Its role includes providing durable materials for transporting captured carbon dioxide. Specifically, nickel is a key ingredient in the steel and alloys used to build the pipelines, ships, and trucks that move liquefied CO2 to storage sites, as these environments can be highly corrosive. Granted, some FeNI may end up being used for these transport storage applications. Lastly, even nickel mine waste can naturally absorb CO2 from the atmosphere through a process called carbon mineralization, showing another, albeit smaller, way nickel helps with carbon capture. So, in short, the green economy requires nickel. Period. And most of the applications involve pure nickel, which can be obtained the right way, underground sulfide mines, or the dirty way, refining of laterite nickel. It's a weird look to make green wind turbines from dirty Indonesian nickel with questionable human rights violations behind its production. All that to say, there are reasons besides cheaper and better EVs and national security to want access to good nickel. From a US policy perspective, this seems like one of those things both sides would likely agree on, even if it's behind closed doors. Part 9. Recycling. Okay, so when it comes to nickel recycling, about 1/4 of global demand is met by secondary, recycled nickel. That's down from 33% in 2015, likely due to the EV-driven uptick in demand for pure nickel. Nickel is 100% recyclable in theory, But the economics of nickel recycling don't always make much sense. Since so many nickel end uses involve Ni plus something else, alloys, separating out the nickel isn't an easy or cheap process. You may think, well, hey, 1/4 is pretty good, right? But this number includes the recycling of stainless steel, which is much easier to recycle. About 35% of nickel in all the stainless steel produced in 2023 was secondary, recycled. For EV batteries, it was 6 to 10%. Now, there is still a fair bit of secondary nickel, and a lot of that comes from what amounts to leftover factory scrap nickel from various manufacturing processes. Just like we discussed in the copper write-up, oftentimes manufacturers end up with extra materials, and that stuff gets shipped right back to the refiner or recycler to be remelted back down into a sellable form. Since most EV batteries aren't yet at their end of life, most of the secondary nickel being used for EV manufacturing was simply leftover nickel from other battery makers. We should expect 2030 to begin with a wave of EV battery recycling boosting nickel supply. Fortunately, nickel doesn't end up in a ton of consumer products, and so it's not floating in small quantities in a landfill like a lot of the copper is. The devil's copper. I may end up with exposure to nickel inadvertently through the secret position, but I'll tell you right now, I'm very wary of this metal. If I've learned anything from writing this, it's just that nickel can be extremely volatile. When nickel prices rise, people look for ways to avoid it entirely, LFPs, or reimagine production, refining of laterite ore into pure nickel. Moreover, Australia has a lot of nickel reserves currently lying dormant. It may take time to bring Australian nickel reserves online, but it's certainly a possible future source of supply. Moreover, Russia coming to a peace deal with Ukraine would likely redirect nickel being used for military applications back into the global market. That could serve as a further supply surge, albeit less extreme than the Australian situation. Yes, nickel-based EV batteries will probably be around for a while, but they're losing market share to LFPs. Battery chemistry is evolving rapidly, and while I don't necessarily have high hopes for sodium-ion batteries, LFP technology may begin to approach an equitable range to nickel-based cathodes. Considering China has found a way to turn Indonesian pickles back into pure nickel cucumbers with new refining capabilities, I'd imagine any surge in nickel prices would eventually trigger a commensurate response in the refining of laterite nickel into pure nickel. Environment be damned. On a global scale, all of the factors don't make me eager to invest directly in nickel. That said, U.S. mineral security appears to be in bad shape, especially where nickel is concerned. Sure, we have Canada, but outside of that, we're really in a bit of a nickel. Get it? Recently, U.S. nickel exploration has focused on sulfide targets in Minnesota, Michigan, and Montana. Talon Metals has accelerated drilling at the Tamarack project in Minnesota, reporting an exceptional high-grade intercept in May 2025, as it advances permitting and studies. That same team kicked off a new program in Michigan's Upper Peninsula, and in late 2024, announced a high-grade discovery about 8 miles from London's Eagle Mine. Meanwhile, Stillwater Critical Minerals is expanding the Stillwater West project in Montana, with resource expansion drilling and added backing from Glencore. And if you need proof the government is behind this, the U.S. Geological Survey's Earth MRI program is flying new geophysical surveys over the Duluth complex to guide future nickel exploration. Domestic production of nickel may become a strategic goal for the U.S., but nickel overall comes with many moving parts that I wouldn't ever want to have to predict with any kind of accuracy. Both supply and demand have big question marks, no matter what time horizon I look at. Just because it has shades of the copper thesis, energy transition, geographical concentration, and national security, doesn't mean it's something I'd be comfortable betting on. It's not copper. It's nickel. The devil's copper. Thanks for listening to the Margin of Sanity podcast. Just a reminder, if you enjoyed the show, it would be awesome if you could drop a like, comment, or 5-star review. It takes a while to do the podcast versions, so a little love definitely helps keep me going. The next deep dive will likely be on the housing and construction market, So definitely hop on over to the Margin of Sanity Substack and subscribe if you want to learn all about that. That's all for me today. Thanks for tuning in, and I'll talk to you later.